Welcome back to Unless, a title inspired by the Lorax. Unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing is going to get better. It's not. Unless is a podcast hosted by teenagers where we discuss mental health. Let's meet our hosts.
Hey guys, I'm Riley.
Hello, I'm Caitlin.
Hi, I'm Brendan.
Hello, I'm Kara, and today we have a new host. Let's meet Ella.
Hi, I'm Ella. I joined Stand Together because I have also struggled with mental illness, including anxiety, depression, OCD, and an eating disorder. I'm going to be a freshman at the University of Pittsburgh next fall, and I'm excited to be working on the Unless podcast.
This episode of Unless is going to talk about mental health portrayed in the media.
Due to the sensitive nature of the topics being discussed, we want to encourage you to keep your own wellness in mind. If at any time during the podcast you're feeling overwhelmed while listening, please take a break and/or talk to an adult that you trust. Remember, we are not experts. Anything we say is simply a matter of opinion and personal experience. Spoiler alert for this episode, we'll be talking about episodes such as Steven Universe, Kimmy Schmidt, Dear Evan Hansen, and 13 Reasons Why. We'll be talking about these episodes in depth, so if you don't want to hear anything about these episodes, please don't listen to this podcast.
Steven Universe is a show on Cartoon Network about title character Steven Universe and his family of sorts, the crystal gems, Garnet, Amethyst, and Pearl. Steven is a half-human, half-gem being who has inherited powers from his mom and her gem. It's all about his adventures and his growth throughout everything happening between him and the gems and the world around them.
So we are actually going to start with Steven Universe Future, which was an extension of the original show, which goes more in depth with mental health problems and the way things take a toll on Steven. So we're going to start with the episode Prickly Pear.
So Prickly Pear focuses on Steven's inability to express emotion, and he feels shame for that. And as a child, we see Steven very optimistic, and he's always eager to help others, and he just wants to help and be a positive, beacon of light almost. But as a teen, we see that this isn't very natural to suppress that emotion, and he struggles to compensate for that, and he's unable to suppress it, and we see that through the Prickly Pear episode.
Along with that, Steven has always felt the need to help because over the years, he has had to deal with not only the issues that involve him, but also the gems, Garnet, Amethyst, and Pearl. They act as parental figures to him other than his actual father, Greg, and he ends up having to solve their own problems, like Pearl having feelings for Steven's dead mother, Rose, who they had a very close connection, and that as he develops a messiah complex, I think, where he has to be the savior all the time.
One thing I think Steven Universe and Steven Universe Future do particularly well is we see a lot of kids shows, all shows really, where the main character goes through a lot of these really harrowing, possibly traumatic experiences that require them to save the world, to be so much bigger than, for most of the series, Steven is 14? And Future really shows how that having all these experiences would affect him mentally, and in a realistic way, whereas other shows might gloss over that. Yeah, and I also think it does a good job with diversity, not only racially, but also a lot of the LGBT community is represented, and they aren't afraid to talk about mental health problems. It's very inclusive, and I think that's really good for kids to see, because not a lot of shows in was it 2012, 2010 when this came out?
2013.
2013, yeah. Not a lot of shows really had that before then. And now, as we see, a lot more shows are following suit and doing that. So with the ideas covered in Prickly Pear, those amount in the episode Growing Pains, where Steven finally goes to see a doctor about it. A lot of good quotes from that are by Dr. Maheshwaran, who is
Connie's mom, Connie being Steven's girlfriend, at one point she says, you've recovered physically, but have you recovered mentally? Because Steven endured so much trauma with his adventures with the crystal gems, but since the gems aren't human, they don't have that kind of toll on themselves. So he never had someone to talk to about it. And she also said how childhood trauma can have a lasting impact on how you react to stress and how your body decides to deal with it.
So that quote I actually resonate with a lot because, like, childhood trauma, I've experienced some of that, and it really does change how you react to stress and to different stimulus. Because for me, loud sounds, anytime I hear a loud sound, even if it's non-threatening, if it's just a sudden loud sound, I jump, and it's really visible. And, you know, seeing that be represented in a show is super cool.
Going off of the childhood trauma and everything, something that Dr. Maheshwaran does say is, you've recovered physically, but have you recovered mentally? Then Steven asks, you think there's something wrong with my brain? And she clarifies, not wrong, that it's not something wrong with his brain. It's just something that's developed. She says it's that adverse childhood experiences can have a lasting impact. It's not saying that it's wrong, it's bad. It's just something different that he's going to have to deal with. And in dealing with that, he ends up talking to his father, Greg, later in the episode. Dr. Maheshwaran says earlier in the episode, all of these experiences have been subjecting your body to a harmful amount of stress that's affecting your ability to respond to new forms of stress in a healthy way. You've been dealing with genuine threats from such a young age. Your body is now responding to minor threats as if your life were in danger. Steven says, my body, it's reacting like it's the end of the world. I should be feeling so good these days. The Earth is safe, it's era 3, but I'm swelling up over these third era problems. What do I do? How do I move on from all the stuff I've been through? How do I live life if it always feels like I'm about to die?
Something I wanted to bring up is that kind of almost parallels with this other episode that I saw online. I don't know if it was before or after this episode, but his internalized pain that he's gone through, like almost his trauma, because he's fighting an intergalactic war and he's suffering with death and loss. And he's trying to find his own role in the universe almost. And his internalized pain is shown by glowing pink because nobody's really letting him help. And his gem is responding to him as if his life is in threatening danger because his body's used to it almost, because he's gone through so much trauma after gone through a lot of trauma, and it's like his body's getting used to it. So I feel like he's trying to like figure out a way to like kind of almost suppress that.
Steven's dad's a really cool character, I think, because he's a father figure that's there for him and supports him. And that's one of the cool things about Growing Pains, the wrap-up of it, is that Steven's dad comes to his help after Connie calls him and is like, hey, I'm here for you. I'm here for you to help, and if you need support. And he helps him, like, ease his concerns and worries. And, like, Steven has somebody there for him.
And real quick, I just want to add, Greg is a good character. He's a good dad, but he is by no stretch of the imagination a perfect father. No one in this show is perfect. No one is, like, everyone has flaws. And that's part of the show, that there's growth, that they see their flaws, they try to fix it, or sometimes they don't. And that's just who they are. And it sucks, but it's just like real life. Sometimes people just don't want to change who they are.
While we're on the topic of, you know, characters other than Steven, I wanted to point out Pearl, who I especially sympathized with when I watched Steven Universe. I think, you know, obviously we cannot diagnose characters, people. That's not our place. That's not what we do. But a lot of fans, I think, online, and me too, as someone who has struggled with OCD, see some of the symptoms of OCD with her that we can relate to, and representation that is more than, oh, just being a perfectionist neat freak is helpful.
So then Growing Pains, throughout the whole thing, Steven keeps saying how he feels like a burden. He doesn't want to go get help because he thinks he's just like in the way of everyone else. And this all builds up into the episode Everything's Fine, where Steven has been denying the clear issues in his life and the trauma in an effort to make things better. He ends up making things worse. He kills one of his friends. He just ruins everything, and he just allows everything to build up to the point where there's no return, and he becomes a giant monster in the next episode. And I also wanted to point out a very interesting parallel where at the end of the episode, when he's laying down and the monster thing shoots out of his back, it's very similar to in the season 4 episode, Mindful Education, when they're discussing the importance of talking about your feelings and things you've done that might be upsetting to you, and butterflies shoot out of Connie's backpack. And I just really love the way that they can symbolize mental health and things that may be weighing on you in a way that allows for conversation without having to have the difficult time of pointing out every little thing. So that leads into I Am My Monster.
So in I Am My Monster, Steven becomes this huge monster because he's bottled up too much inside of him, and he's not responding to anybody, but he has all of the gems, and he has his friends surrounding him, and he has his dad with him. And they're all trying to find a way to, get him back to human, and they're all trying different things, and it's not working, so they ended up blaming themselves. In a moment, the gems were all it's my fault that he's like this. It's my fault that I didn't notice this. It's my fault that all this is happening. And his dad was like, this is my fault because I didn't help him. And in that moment, Connie comes in. She's like, guys, this isn't helping. You're putting the center of blame onto yourselves instead of putting it where it should be, and it should be on Steven. Because Steven doesn't really focus on himself enough, and he has been there for all of them, but he was never there for himself. So they needed to switch the narrative and put it onto focusing on getting Steven better. They all decided that the best way to do that is to genuinely show him love and show them support and show them that they care about him. So it's not that Steven's hopeless. They don't make it seem like Steven will never get better. They're like, we're here to help you. We're here to help whatever you need. They are there to support him.
So in the end, Steven ends up being able to talk about his feelings, and the last episode, we skip a bit in the future, and he mentions how even though he's on the road and he's going to be moving on to a different stage of his life, he's still getting help, and he can still call his therapist and talk about his feelings. And I think that's really good to show that help is not a one-time thing, and even aren't actively experiencing painful things. For him, it was still helpful to continue going. So that was a really nice way to wrap it up.
The next segment we're going to talk about is Dear Evan Hansen, which is a musical about a student named Evan who experiences anxiety. Another student, Connor Murphy, commits suicide due to his depression, and his family finds a note on Connor's body that makes Evan seem like he was his friend, but he wasn't. Evan goes along with this lie, and he makes fake emails that make it seem like he was Connor's friend in the past, and he gets really close to Connor's family, and it feels really good for him to be a part of this family that loves him, but he eventually has to come clean, and it kind of breaks up the family a little bit. So I think Dear Evan Hansen has some good representation and some bad representation of mental health. So first of all, it's two boys that are dealing with these mental disorders and these mental illnesses, and that's something that I think is forgotten a lot, is that men also experience mental illnesses, and to have that represented is something that's a little bit important.
I think it's really important to bring awareness to men suffering from mental health disorders, because normally when a guy expresses that he might have a mental health disorder, people take it that he's just not manly enough, or that he just can't handle everyday life as a man. And I feel like that's something that we should get rid of, is toxic masculinity, almost that men can't express feelings. And I feel like that's something that should be get rid of, so that men can just be able to express their feelings. And that's something that this play does well, is having men express how they're feeling and that they're not like being judged for it almost. It's something really good that the musical does well.
And I think with that, it even discusses it directly. Like when dealing with the loss of his son, Connor's dad like says how he doesn't feel like he should be sad about it and that he has to be the strong one in the family to help his wife and daughter deal with it. But in the end, that doesn't do him any good. And it shows, similar to Steven Universe, how repressing things doesn't make it better. It just makes the discussion more difficult whenever you eventually get to it.
So I think that the portrayal of Evan's anxiety is, for the most part, pretty accurate. So the main problem with Evan was that he was avoiding confrontation, and it turned into him feeding into this big lie that was harming a family, but he was trying to make the family happy because they didn't want them to be sad about what happened to their son. And that's something that I guess it looks like it's making anxiety seem like something that makes people manipulative, or like he's using it to manipulate people. But I would say that like logic and reasoning is a little bit different whenever you're under these stressful situations and you have like an anxiety disorder. So confrontation is terrifying, and it may have seemed like a careless decision, but if he could avoid hurting a family, then he was going to feed into the lie.
You bring up some good points, Riley. I felt like overall the musical was not as successful in really portraying mental illness in a correct manner, mostly because of the way it handles things like Connor's suicide and Evan's anxiety, where I personally, this is my personal opinion, I didn't feel like the musical gave us enough time and reason to sympathize with these characters, so that instead of empathizing with their struggles, it's very easy for the audience to think that they're just being kind of jerks, which is not the message we want to be sending about people who have mental illnesses, you know? Mental illnesses do not make you a jerk, obviously. And I feel like even though that wasn't the message that Dear Evan Hansen was going for, it might have unintentionally spread that for some people.
Yeah, I think that a part of them spreading some stigmas behind like mental illnesses and characters acting a certain way because they have these mental illnesses is that one of Connor's main things is that he is a violent student, and that it was said that he used drugs as a coping mechanism, which are both negative things and are, first of all, the violence as like how he expressed himself was not how people who are depressed always act. That's not something that like is in relation to that. And him using drugs as a coping mechanism is obviously very unhealthy and not something that anybody should use. I think that another thing was that Evan says in one of the songs in response to Connor using drugs was, take deep breaths and go on walks. Like that would solve things. And I think that like in the musical, Evan goes to therapy, and I think that that's like great that he goes to therapy and he's getting help through that. But there's also like another idea that like taking deep breaths and going on walks would solve things. And another like push to that narrative was that Evan has these anxiety meds, and at one point he becomes a little more popular and is in like a better place in his life, and he stops using the anxiety medicine and everything is just fine. And it's not like a cure for somebody to like, I became more popular, so now I don't really need my anxiety medicine. It's not really that simple. So I think that, like, you know, Dear Evan Hansen is kind of a mix between good and bad representation in terms of mental illness.
I feel like it would have worked better in the format of a TV show where we had time to get to know the characters and have that development. Because like you said, Connor's character is that he's violent, he does drugs, and he ends up taking his own life. We aren't given time to know more about him or to sympathize about him. So it creates like a caricature in a way and just uses that to carry on the story. And also with Evan's anxiety going into it, someone might not think it's gonna be that realistic because it's not as represented in the soundtrack. So if you only listen to that, which that's what I did, then I went into the show and I saw an anxiety attack being represented, and it caused me to start having an anxiety attack and like emulating what I was seeing. So while it is good to have a representation of anxiety in more of a like mainstream type show like that, it can also be harmful in that aspect. So overall, it's like a 50-50.
Okay, the next show we're going to be discussing is 13 Reasons Why. And 13 Reasons Why is the story of a young high school student as she descends into despair brought on by betrayal and bullying, culminating with her to suicide. She details the 13 reasons why she was driven to end her life in an audio diary, which is mailed to a friend 2 weeks later after her death. And this show has portrayed mental health in a very negative light, and that's what we're going to be talking about next.
So this show, I haven't seen it, but I've done some research on it, and it really glorifies and romanticizes suicide as like there's this charming dead girl who is sending out these cassettes about people who wronged her, and it makes suicide seem literally like the only option. And it makes it seem like after all this has happened to her, the only thing that she could possibly do is commit suicide. And that's a super negative thing to do. And it's not shown that like she reached out for support at all. And they actually show on the TV show that somebody self-harms themselves. And it caused a huge issue after that because there were teenagers who were seeing that and were like seeing that as an option. And it caused the whole show to like change what they had shown. And actually a quote from the show 13 Reasons Why is, "Suicide is for cowards. This is what you do to not commit suicide," as if self-harm is like the healthier option or that it's the better option when it's just not. It also doesn't like take away the suicidal urge, and it means that you need help if you are self-harming yourself. During the show, it doesn't really show a narrative that the adults are involved at all. It doesn't show, like, even after these cassette tapes, which involve pretty graphic things, they're not given to adults or authorities. And, you know, it's our jobs to, if something's happening, to take that to a professional or to an adult that you trust and get them to help you.
Another thing about 13 Reasons Why that really stood out to me when I watched it, or attempted to, was that Hannah's suicide is very much a revenge act. And in reality, that's just not true at all. Suicide and self-harm are more often than not a cry for help, and saying that there are 13 separate reasons, and Hannah was looking for revenge on these very discrete events that had happened to her. While they all could have had an impact, and certainly did, there is ultimately no one or even 13 set of answers as to why a suicide happened.
So yeah, in 13 Reasons Why, there really is no narrative that is her getting, of anybody really getting support and getting help and changing. And there was no actual diagnosis for depression for Hannah. And she took her own life, and it devolved into something that was just not good as a show. And in this way, like, they needed to push more of a narrative of, like, get support, hope, and encouragement. There is hope for you. Suicide is not the answer. Self-harm is not the answer. And the people who do experience those urges and do things like that need to get help and talk to an adult.
So one show that does this really well, which is the last show we are going to be discussing before we actually get to talk to an expert, is Kimmy Schmidt on Netflix. So she spent about 15 years of her life in a bunker outside of the real world, and she experienced a lot of trauma during that time. and she developed PTSD. And now that she's back in the real world, it shows her trying to move on from that while still experiencing symptoms and flashbacks. The show is really positive because it shows her going to get help. She goes to see a therapist, and there's hope that things are getting better, and they are. And she's able to learn how she can move past this, and it doesn't define her. She can still live her everyday life while still recognizing that, yes, that's a part of her and that's okay. Well, she doesn't get like fully like cured in the end, because you can't cure everything with one like therapist appointment. It still sends a really good message that things won't go away overnight. You have to work on things, and eventually it will get better. Even if it doesn't fully go away, things can change and work out in your favor.
And all I want to say about Kimmy Schmidt was that we see her putting her life back together, and though sometimes she's got a very bubbly personality, sometimes that is dropped and we realize it's a bit of an act, but it also subverts the idea that like all people with mental illness have to be, have to look like they are suffering, act like they are suffering all the time, because that's simply not the truth. Kimmy Schmidt also, as we just mentioned, goes to therapy, starts getting an education, finds a house, and starts having romantic relationships. In one episode where she begins thinking about plastic surgery because she doesn't want her past to define her, she doesn't want to be recognizable anymore, she is able to overcome that and decide she doesn't want that anymore because it's about her emotional journey rather than her physical one. I think that's an important message. Stand Together is a student-to-student initiative that inspires and equips youth to take action against stigma associated with mental illness and substance abuse disorders. It engages middle and high school students by providing anti-stigma training and service learning experiences. Students work to stand together to increase education and awareness, increase social inclusion, and encourage adolescents to talk to an adult if they are concerned about their own or another student's mental health. At this point in the episode, we'd like to take a minute to just ask each other how we're doing. Kara, would you like to start us off?
I am doing really good today. I woke up and I was like, we're going to do this podcast. I still had to do some of my research on shows. And yeah, I was just having a good day. I feel a lot better than I did yesterday. Yesterday was kind of like a sad day for me. But, doing pretty good. Yeah. Riley, why don't you go next?
I'm doing pretty okay. I was a little bit stressed these past few days, but I have been doing some fun things, I think. I've been playing around with body paint a lot, and I painted my entire face the other day. I don't know, I try to find new ways to just be like, let's just do things. I haven't been outside in a little while, though, so I think that's what I'm going to do after we're done recording. All right, next, Kate, how you feeling?
I'm feeling pretty good now that we've got stuff recorded. There was a moment where I was really frustrated because this is the second time recording things, but now we're good. Feeling better than I have lately, so that's cool. Brendan, if you'd like to go next.
I'm all right, not too bad. I'm not bad at all, really. I'm just tired. Things are just weird, but when aren't things weird nowadays? I mean, I don't know. I'm just doing well. I've had fun. This is fun. This podcast is like Olive Garden, because when we're here together, we're a family. Well, you know what? Now I think I'm gonna pass it off to Ella. Ella, how you doing?
I'm doing good now. Been having a rough go of it lately in terms of negative body image thoughts, but the important thing is to just like keep pushing through them and realize that is your brain speaking, and your brain is not always right. So that just about wraps up this segment. Next up, we're going to talk to some professionals and ask them what their opinions on some of these pieces of media are. Would you guys like to introduce yourselves?
Hi, I'm Meredith Gillow, and I am a school psychologist. I work at West Allegheny School District.
Hi, I'm Erica Cicero. I'm also a school psychologist at the West Allegheny School District, and it's good to be with you all today.
All right, awesome. So you guys have both watched a little bit of Steven Universe, is that correct? You watched some of the episodes?
Yes, I did.
So do you think that is good representation in terms of anything that is shown on there?
I was really impressed with the way that they talk about feelings on Steven Universe. The episode I saw where he goes to the doctor, and I know you guys talked some about that in yours as well. She really talks to him about how you have to let your feelings out and how it's okay to feel however you feel about things. No one is perfect. I liked how they talked about making self-care a priority. So Steven is this person who has been tasked with like taking care of the world, and he has all these adults around him who are caring, good adult models, but he has to help them all the time. He's kind of bailing them out, and his friends and these other people. So I thought it was great when the doctor talked to him about self-care. I also watched the episode that has the song, season 4, episode 4, I believe, that has the song in it. And again, I was just really impressed with the way they talk about finding yourself and being true to yourself. As I was sort of looking through things, something that I would like to maybe watch a little more and see a little more about is the character of Spinell, who is dealing with issues of trauma and abandonment. So I guess my big takeaway on Steven Universe is that it's really pretty deep for a cartoon aimed at kids. There's a ton of positive messages in there. It's very inclusive. The characters have deep relationships. There are trusted adults that are well represented. So I think it painted a really nice picture.
Yeah, I think one of the cool things is that there's like takeaways for any audience of it. There's good takeaways for kids. There's good takeaways for adults. Like a lot of the adults are role models on the show, and I think that's really cool to tailor it to so many audiences and have it be like a great message within it.
I like the way, and I haven't been able to watch all of them, but I've watched some. I like the way they use music to communicate their feelings, and to sort of lift the mood or even change the mood. And I was just impressed with the variety, again, that I saw. There are ballads where they're talking about your feelings, but then there are these songs where the characters are kind of angry and they get bigger, and they just do a nice job with the visual representation.
Definitely. Speaking of music, the musical Dear Evan Hansen, do you think that it is good representation, bad representation, or kind of both in terms of mental health?
So I think one of the first things I want to say about that and what's important is it's representation. So just the fact that a major Broadway play fronted by a star, is talking about these mental health issues is really important. So any representation, I think, gives people something to connect with. And I think Evan Hansen has positives and maybe some things that aren't as great. I think social anxiety is something that a lot of teenagers deal with. So the fact that they tackled it is important. And I wanted to say too, because I listened to what you guys put together, and I had taken some notes and looked at some things. And one of the things that you said that I thought was great that I hadn't thought about was it's male representation too. So a lot of times in media, mental health is presented as like a woman's problem. And women are viewed as being more prone to being sad and depressed and anxious. And that's not the case. Men struggle with mental health. Teenagers, male and female, struggle with mental health. So I think it's really important that they do have that representation. And I was impressed that you guys pointed that out. So the other thing that I wanted to point out when I was looking through things that I found out is cast members from Dear Evan Hansen get a lot of fan mail, and they get a lot from people who share some of the mental health difficulties. So they actually put a system in place for addressing that. And I think that that is a really socially responsible thing. So if you're going to present issues of mental health, and if you're going to, demonstrate someone almost having a panic attack on stage, then having the resources is really important. So they've partnered with local mental health agencies. And when they get these emails, when they get these letters, they respond to them with the help of a counselor. They send out resources. So I did want to give a big shout out for the social responsibility element of doing that. I think that it's really important that they realized that that was something they needed to do.
So I was just going to piggyback on what Meredith said, that speaking about portraying men's mental health in the media, I do think is important, because as we know, while females attempt suicide more often, males actually have a higher completion rate. So I think that anytime we can kind of remove that stigma around, it's being a sissy or it's being weak, if a male deals with some mental health and kind of portray it in a more positive light that these are real issues that males and females alike kind of deal with, that's a good thing. So I think that was really positive that you pointed that out as well.
What kind of message do you think Dear Evan Hansen sends about people with anxiety and people with depression?
I think that there has been some concern raised about the way that it portrays a person who's dealing with anxiety, in the very fact that, if you haven't seen it, it's a spoiler alert, but it's all based on a big lie. However, I heard one of you mention today, he tells the lie in the heat of the moment. He is in a very anxiety-producing situation, and he is a person who has difficulties with anxiety. So it will affect your thought processes and your ability to plan and decide in the moment. So that may very well be an accurate portrayal, but the bigger message that maybe it sends to someone who isn't as familiar with how anxiety works could potentially be, a concern that a person could possibly be manipulative. I think that one of the other things that would be on the less positive side is kind of the trajectory, especially for a teenager, of you become this big viral media sensation and like all your problems are solved. So all of a sudden, Evan has friends and he's popular and they want him to start these groups. And that's not necessarily how things work out. And, I think that on one hand, it's walking the line of talking about the dangers of social media, but then it also does sometimes veer off in the other direction of kind of glorifying how becoming a viral video sensation can all of a sudden make people like you, and sort of obscure who you are. Again, I just want to say that, I think that the adults are generally presented as caring. I think it's also important to note that they talk about the fact that he has had difficulties in his relationships with his mom. He lives in a sort of a stressful situation. They're looking at colleges, there's financial concerns. So I think that they do talk about a lot of real life things that teenagers deal with.
Definitely. So the next topic was going to be Kimmy Schmidt.
I think yesterday Ella brought up a really good point about how even though she is suffering from PTSD, she doesn't let it define her, and she doesn't have like an awful depressing demeanor. She doesn't look like someone who would have PTSD, if that makes sense. It represents how not just one kind of person can suffer from that. And I just wanted to ask about how important that is. And I'm not good with words, I'm sorry.
No, that's okay, Kate. Again, it's representation, which is important. And I think that you're exactly right. The way that they show sort of the residual effects of the PTSD for her is different than how they often show it. A lot of times when the media talks about PTSD, it's in, following a big violent event, or it's someone who has been in the military and fought. When it kind of sneaks up slyly in that show. They'll show her waking up from a nightmare. But it's not constantly in your face. It isn't her as a person. We talk in Stand Together about person first language. It is not that, PTSD doesn't define her. She's a person who has this, but she's coping with it. She still makes relationships. She is still, in general, sort of a bright and sunny person. So I think it really is sort of flipping on its head how people with mental health difficulties are typically portrayed in the media. And that's a good thing.
I also think that, we talk a lot about how mental health looks different in everyone, and that also mental health doesn't discriminate. Mental health isn't looking at one certain type of person or SES or race or gender. So I think that's important to kind of get that message across, that just like we say, if you know one person with autism, you know one person with autism. Same with mental health. There's a very, very wide spectrum, and it presents very differently in everyone. And I think that's important to keep in mind.
I think with that on the show, it represents 4 different people who are dealing with PTSD, and they're all experiencing it and dealing with it in different ways, despite the fact that they all had the same experience. And I think that's really good to show that it's not like a one size fits all kind of thing, which goes along with what you said about autism.
And the second season is really about her sort of coming to grips and realizing, much like we talked about with Steven Universe, when you're the person who tries to fix everything for everyone, sometimes you lose yourself in that. So she realizes like she needs to take care of herself. And that's important. And that's one of the primary messages of Stand Together is if you're struggling, if you need help, seek help.
The last thing we have on our list is 13 Reasons Why, which I think we can all agree is pretty bad representation. And Ms. Cicero, please feel free to talk about that.
So finally, a show I have seen. I feel a little bit relevant now. So I'm going to start out with the positives on 13 Reasons Why, just so we can start off on a positive note in the things they did get right or try to get right. First and foremost, they do show a diverse cast, diverse difficulties that high school students might struggle with. So we'll give them an A for that. I also think they tried to make improvements between season 1 and season 2. Those improvements came because of backlash from every mental health organization in the world, but they did put the disclaimer at the beginning of the episodes. They put resources at the beginning and end of every show, which I thought was obviously a step in the right direction. And the last positive I would say is it got a lot of people talking. It started out for a negative reason why people were talking, but it opened up that conversation. I think probably even within homes, it opened up that conversation between parents and children. It made parents kind of check a little bit of like, what is my kid watching? What is this? I know, Meredith watched it with her daughter. So hopefully some of those conversations were helpful in just having the conversation about mental illness, what to do if you are struggling or know someone who's struggling. Those are my positives. Negatives. Obviously, season 1 came without any type of warning, so we potentially had at-risk youth watching this show without any warning, and if you're already someone who's feeling pretty at risk, depressed, potentially having suicidal thoughts, it glorified it. It glamorized it. It was very, very graphic. It showed things that shouldn't have been shown on a television show. And more than that, what Meredith and I have talked about was one of our biggest concerns. The way it portrayed suicide, she was gone for the entire season. And it showed her as this everlasting presence who got to look back and see what was going on and, you know, watch all this revenge. And that's not the way suicide works. It's final. So we didn't like that it showed that it wasn't a final step. Meredith, did you have something to add there?
The same could be said for Dear Evan Hansen. Even though Connor died by suicide, he was a huge presence. I mean, he was kind of the driving person behind the whole play. So I don't feel like either one of them did a great job in addressing the finality. You know, if you die by suicide, you're not going to be kind of watching over this whole thing that happened. So I'm glad that that was mentioned.
Yeah, I mean, that was huge for us because it
we
just
talked a lot.
Like, you're just watching, taking it all in, seeing how life unfolds. Not accurate. We also had major issues with it placed blame on each person for why she ended up completing suicide, never mentioning mental health really at all until season 2. I think maybe they brought it up maybe once. But no one ever talked about, you know, prior history. You know, was she seeking treatment? Did she have a diagnosis? And we know that 90% of people who die by suicide do have a diagnosable and treatable mental illness. So that was left out. And we really just took it to bullying causes suicide, which we know it can be a risk factor, but it's not a causation.
So I wanted to say, I think after they had the backlash, they learned, but it wasn't reflected as much in that show. But the same people went on to create The Politician, which also deals with mature themes such as suicide. But from the start, they had the warnings. They didn't depict anything graphically. And I think, like, once you have a show made, there's only so much you can do with it. But I think they learned, and they have been trying to improve with that. And they also do address the person who takes their own life, River. Like, he's seen again in the show, but they do address, like, hey, he's not real. He's gone. He can't impact things that actually happen. And it's more of the main character's, like, memory of him rather than him seeing, like, revenge. And I thought that was really good to see, even though he is still there, and that gives the false sense of things not being final. The way they dealt with it was a lot better than in 13 Reasons Why and Dear Evan Hansen. So.
And I think that's an important point. You know, they learn from feedback, and it's important to listen to what professionals say and sort of adjust things. And I would say about 13 Reasons Why too, I think that the intentions going in, as I think the intentions going in with all of these, were likely very good. We're going to make a show for teenagers about an important, serious subject that they can relate to. So I think that the intentions are often good.
The other thing that was super absent was any type of therapeutic support or help. And when she finally did talk to the counselor in school, it was depicted in the most negative fashion, basically insinuating that school counselors are negligent and ignored this, and this is what happened. So it wasn't portraying seeking out a trusted adult in a positive light at all, further stigmatizing guidance counselors and school counselors within that environment. So that was another major issue that we had. I think just in general, when you look at the mental health aspect and what we want to show adolescents or even adults is that there is help and you have a trusted adult. Seek out that trusted adult and they'll connect you with the right support. And 13 Reasons Why showed the exact opposite.
And I would say of all the things that we talked about, the 4 things we talked about, 3 of the 4 are hopeful. Even at the end in Dear Evan Hansen, there's a redemption there. We could argue about whether it's deserved or not, but it's there. It's hopeful. It presents the picture that you will, you know, get through a rough time. Kimmy Schmidt is an extremely optimistic, hopeful show, and so is Steven Universe, even though there are sad parts. I didn't see a lot of like hopefulness in 13 Reasons Why. It's kind of a dark and bleak, and for a teenager struggling already with mental health concerns, there's not a lot of healthy depictions in there.
Even with adults to seek out that support from, some parents were completely absent. Some parents just, while they were there for their kids, they had blinders on to everything that was going on. And then you had your school professionals who were not really portrayed in a positive light. So it kind of left at one point we have a group of adolescents solely trying to determine how to cover up their friends' almost school shooting. That's just not what we want to depict to anybody, in that, it's just left within the adolescent group and not seeking out that adult support, which was hugely crucial.
You're absolutely right.
I was just going to say, I applaud the efforts of trying to have a relevant show that, depicts what high school kids go through, because what you all go through is not easy. High school is challenging on a daily basis, and there are a lot of different battles that you all have daily that we didn't necessarily have when we were in school. But I think they kind of took it, put it into this little small bubble, and then exploded it, and didn't really focus on any of the positive things you all have in your lives, because you also have those too.
So why is it bad to diagnose people or characters, but it's okay to draw parallels by recognizing symptoms in a character?
I would just say that in general, even as professionals, we try not to diagnose first and foremost without having a full evaluation, or without more information. But finding symptoms that you can relate to, or that you notice in somebody that you see in somebody else, is okay, because you're more so picking out characteristics and behaviors rather than putting that label out there. Most people are not professionals, that they can't just throw out a diagnosis, but we hear that a lot. Oh, that person has anxiety, or that person is bipolar. That happens a lot just in daily life, but we really want to make sure we're not adding to the lack of education and the stigma, and just making sure we're pointing out behaviors and characteristics and things that we can see, observe, rather than jumping to that next step. Meredith, do you have anything you want to add there?
I would say that things manifest differently in different people. So how I feel anxiety is probably different than how you feel anxiety. In order to diagnose, you really need to have a face-to-face conversation with someone. You need to know which questions to ask. And I think that it's important, especially with teenagers, because symptoms are often similar. So the symptoms of depression, of anxiety, of ADHD, of an autism spectrum disorder, these things can all be sort of difficult. There's a lot of overlap. So you do need to make sure that you have a thorough evaluation, that the right questions are asked. The person is the best source of information that you have, but you have to be in the place where you can sort of put words to what you're feeling. And the other thing that I want to say, and I know that, Ms. Cicero will echo this, is you do not have to have a diagnosis to seek treatment. You can talk to a school counselor, a school psychologist, a social worker. These people are there for you, and they will see you whether or not you have written down on paper that, you have a diagnosis of something. There are times in your life when you may have symptoms of something, but it's a situational type of thing. And it doesn't mean that it's something that you're going to be dealing with long term, but you still seek help for it. So you don't have to have a diagnosis. And I think we often, and honestly, it's because of insurance and things like that, but we tend to get hung up on, well, what does this person have? It manifests different for everybody. So that's not always as important in the therapeutic aspect of things.
Well, thank you guys so much for coming out and talking to us about this. It really means a lot to us. Any final notes for this episode from you guys?
I would just say, as a professional in the school setting, my biggest hope for students in general, adolescents, is that they would seek support when they need it. Remember that Friends are there to listen and support, hope, and encourage. She, obviously. But that we want to make sure we get in touch with a trusted adult or professional to connect us to that next level. And trusted adults look different for everyone. Teacher, coaches, parents, relatives, counselors, psychologists, priests, anyone in your life that you feel comfortable talking with. But just make sure you reach out and seek out the help.
And if you have a friend that's struggling, direct them. So go see your school counselor, go see your school psychologist. If you're not sure where to start, ask. I know our Stand Together students at West Allegheny all know where to direct someone who's having difficulty. And I'm sure all of you do in your respective schools as well. So as, part of our school communities, we need to look out for each other. So if you see someone struggling, if you see something on social media that makes you uncomfortable or nervous for someone, it's not up to you to judge whether or not it's serious enough or, students are the best ally of other students. So help each other and look for the people who are there to help you. All of your schools have them.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Unless, a student discussion on mental health. We would like to conclude with a quote from Dr. Seuss's The Lorax. Unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing is going to get better. It's not. Our social media will be linked in the description, along with mental health resources and hotlines. Join us in our next episode as we continue our discussion on mental health.